Yeah, amazing. She was on the Got Talent.
I can see you now, Kayla.
Perfect, we should be live now.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the Governance and Priorities Committee meeting of Monday, November 6th to order at, I know 5-something here, 5:01. And I'm doing this virtually, so because I can't figure out who's talking too much, I will turn this meeting over to Deputy Mayor Shannon. And I only ask that people speak quite loudly into their microphone to help Mr. Boychuk and myself here, perhaps. Thank you.
Okay, I will start with the adoption of the agenda. Are there any additions and deletions from anyone? I have none, thank you. Okay, could I have a motion to accept that? Dawn, thank you, or Councillor Good, sorry, thank you. And adoption of minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. All in favor of that, sorry. And that is carried, so we'll go on to adoption of minutes.
I'll move that council adopt the minutes of October 2nd, 2023 Governance Parties Committee meeting as presented.
All those in favor? And that is carried. Comments from the public? None. Presentations? There are none. Moving on to review of bylaws and policy. Number 1, proposed public spaces bylaw. Director Bell.
I'm on my way. Great. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Council, before you is a first draft of a bylaw, which my first change potentially is calling it camping bylaw as opposed to public spaces, but for discussion purposes. We are exploring the development of a bylaw to address camping in town-owned properties and public spaces. Excuse me. There have been a number of situations over the past year and in past years where town staff, members of the community, we've encountered individuals camping on town property. For example, this past summer, we had an individual that was at the water park for approximately over 3 days. Not a location that camping would be permitted for all sorts of reasons. We have no current process, no current mechanisms to address these types of situations on town property. We can use the Trespass Act, but that's not a great mechanism per se, and does not necessarily allow the RCMP to assist us in enforcement when needed, because we don't always have a peace officer readily available to address all issues imminently. A bylaw would assist with being able to address some of those issues in a fairly quick manner. Now, we're not addressing any sort of I'm sorry, I'm post illness, so my brain is not functioning at full power right now. When it comes to addressing an individual, the process of giving notice, that's the word I was looking for. That is more of an administrative procedural function, not necessarily presented within the bylaw that's presented to you tonight. So whether it's a 24, 48 hours notice, whether it's a visit by whom the peace officer or the RCMP officer, what that process would be an administrative function that will be worked into a procedure or a process by either of those parties. This particular draft bylaw is modeled after the town of Canmore. They've had some significant issues in the past, so we've utilized their bylaw as a bit of our template to follow. I would like to point out a number of components within the bylaw because they're of interest and importance. We do have a mechanism within the bylaw that allows the CAO to allow camping in certain circumstances. And we put this in on purpose because we have had lots of situations in the past where we've had very large events like at 12 Foot Davis when Peace Fest was very active, and you would have overnight security. Or you'd have a concession operator that has all their goods set up in a trailer or whatnot, and they would stay on site overnight to provide security again for their goods and items. So there is a mechanism within the bylaw to relax the bylaw for those situations. The bylaw currently, again, doesn't identify a notification period. That will be a procedure that we will address separately outside of the bylaw and how those steps would be taken. Fees still need to be determined. We are still looking for some further information and feedback from both our peace officer and the RCMP, and we'll develop the fees. So the initial draft that we've provided you does not include a fees component as of yet. So we wanted to bring the bylaw forward to council for a first conversation to see if we're on the right track, if this meets some of council needs. It addresses some of the situations that administration has had to deal with in the past, recent and not so recent past. So we're looking for direction and feedback from council.
Councillor Carr?
On the penalties, how are you going to collect those? Like, it's one thing to assess them, but how do you collect them?
Good question. I'm not sure. Depending on the situation, if it's an individual that is within the community that we're aware of, that has an address, that's a possibility. If we don't have any information on the individual, that's where I think there might be a challenge.
Are there any more questions?
Reading this, I think is actually really good. I think there's a lot of good thought in it. The one question I have is, this covers, and I know that this is specific to areas under our control. But just that, where I see a possible gap, and I'm not sure if it's covered under zoning bylaws. Let's assume you had a business with a chunk of property. And it was, let's say, within the town limits or whatever, they wanted to allow 20 people to camp there for an amount of period of time. Would the zoning bylaws cover temporary? Because a structure has to have a certain amount of conditions on it. Would there be something in the bylaw that would say that, for example, that let's say you had a business who wanted to allow 10 people to camp behind their business, whatever.
Yeah.
You can go there and say, well, there are zoning bylaws would say tents are not, you can't have tents in the back of your. Well, I'll let you an example. When I had the store downtown, we had
Yeah.
that chunk behind, which was sort of under our control. Would there have been anything if we had said, and we never did, but if we had said, oh yeah, you put a tent there, no problem. That would control that sort of thing, because I can think in the downtown areas, there's a number of places where there's property, and I know that in the past, we've had people who were, more willing to accommodate people
Yes,
on their property
yes.
under different circumstances than tents. But I'm wondering if zoning covers that, and maybe it's not the discussion for this, but I think it's something that we should take a look at also.
Sure, and I believe zoning would cover it, but I would have to look into that a little further to confirm
It might be.
that it does.
But honestly, and the other part is with parts that you have outlined here, like the legal review of the section.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're correct that you're going to need to review that.
We will ask legal to do a review for us and make sure that this meets all requirements and
But I like
Yeah.
the direction it's going.
great.
Councillor Scalmer, did you have a question?
I think Councillor Good actually addressed it in his. Just around the limitation.
Mayor Manzer?
I have a question with respect to numbers 14 and 15. Just sort of the sequence. So everybody would get a violation tag. And if that doesn't work out, eventually they get a ticket. Is that the way it goes?
I believe I've asked for feedback from our peace officer to make sure that that flow is accurate or consistent with other enforcement bylaws. So I'm just waiting for some feedback on that. So I had that highlighted also in my version, which isn't highlighted here. To
Thanks.
confirm
I was
that
just
tag
wondering
ticket.
about how long an extension this could be. If you get a tag for a while and then you get a ticket for a while. that kind of-
That would.
I just wonder
in
about
this
timing.
Yeah, timing wise, I would want this one to be fairly quick. Because as an example, that I use the water park camping situation as a very tangible example. 3 days was way too long. It made it very uncomfortable for all the other participants and visitors to the site to utilize that space. So I'm hoping for a much quicker turnaround. It wouldn't be like our unsightly premises bylaw where there's a requirement for a 5-day notice prior to cleanup. It would have to be much faster. So that piece is an area that needs a little bit more attention. I would agree.
Are there any more questions for Director Bell? Councillor Cox?
This would only apply to town property too, correct? That
That-
wouldn't apply to over the riverbank or
That's
like.
correct. That's correct.
These
So
are
it wouldn't
buildings.
apply to private property, crown property, provincial property. It's when I reference crown. This would only apply to town-owned property, roadways, right-of-ways, public utility lots, parks, playgrounds, that type of thing. Trails.
Would it apply to town leased properties? I'm being specific with the wording.
I would have to double check
I
how
can think of some
worded
properties that
it.
we have very long-term leases.
It may, yeah, it will.
So just check it.
Yes, yeah, leased by the town, yeah. Public place means any land owned or leased by the town.
Okay.
Yeah, so we did capture that under the definition of public place.
Okay.
Yeah, so any location that we're leasing for public use. Or other use.
Councillor Scummer?
So in your research for this bylaw, was there anything that you were able to come up with that might potentially apply for some of these other areas that are outside of our direct control that we might be able to make a move on, or is this still, our hands are kind of tied here, like?
Your hands are a little tied. We'll check further into the zoning component, because that might be another mechanism where we have a little bit more avenue.
Yep.
Yeah, that might be the only other avenue that I'm aware of, but we'll keep digging and seeing what other
Yeah.
options there are.
Like if I lost my bike over the last few days, I probably wouldn't find it on town property. You
Probably.
know what I mean?
Any other questions? Is there anyone ready to make a motion?
Councillor
Okay,
Boychuk has his hand up.
Yeah, okay.
Councillor Boychuk?
Okay, one thing I would look at there is the definition of county. Are we, and we may want to include setting up a residence or people experiencing homelessness. And if they are, I'd like to see maybe 2 paths. If people are experiencing homelessness, we can maybe take a path of connection with sports, but and that kind of thing, and then move into punishment instead of just punishing somebody down on their luck right away and they set up a tent somewhere and next thing you know they got to.
Sure, and that I would suggest would be in that procedure that would be developed in terms of whether it's the RCMP or a peace officer attending a site. Within their procedure, the first thing I would hope that they would do is have a conversation of why are they there, and then potentially pull in other resources if needed. But also at the same time, providing that here are some other options of where to go, rather than setting up a campsite in a water park or a green space. So that would be definitely the first go-to. We wouldn't address that in a bylaw. That's part of the procedural process.
And are we gonna mention anything about the street team that's handling encampments and stuff like that in this bylaw, or is it? kind of keep
No,
that
not in the
separate?
bylaw. No, I would never reference a community resource within a bylaw in that way. Again, that would be referenced within more of a procedural process. Yeah. Because the name of that program might change, or there's all sorts of scenarios that you wouldn't want to reference that particularly in the bylaw. That's definitely a process procedural component.
Counselor Good?
There's also the section, traffic restrictions 5, where the line says where a sign or other traffic control device authorized by the town indicates that a place may be used for that purpose. So it's within the town's prerogative to name a space or to have a space where you could say theoretically, if you need a place to get permit, you can go here.
Here is the way. Yeah.
This is the place of that. So I think that to an extent might address some of that issue.
Yes, potentially, for sure. And there's lots of situations, as we've seen just recently with the Northwest wildfires. High Level specifically relaxed their bylaw to allow random camping within the community as people were needing to flee from that emergency situation. So this gives you the mechanism, it gives the administration a mechanism to be able to say, please use Centennial parking lot or use wherever needs to be designated, or we could relax the bylaw for a period of time for those types of situations. And I'm sure there's others, but that's a most recent example.
Are there any more questions for Director Bell? Seeing none, would someone be willing to put forward a motion?
So I'll move that council direct admin to bring the proposed public spaces bylaw forward to a future meeting for further discussion.
All those in favor? Carried. And we'll continue with the Director Bell and the proposed roadside memorial bylaw.
Thank you. Let's make a note so I didn't forget. All right, the proposal before council is a draft policy. We were looking at a bylaw, but made the decision to actually move towards a policy on this particular item. It doesn't necessarily need to be a bylaw. It could be a policy administered through it. It'll be predominantly through the engineering department because it's more of a roadside situation, or even planning, roads, engineering. The draft policy for council this evening, it's actually quite simple policy. It's directing members of the public. These situations happen where an individual is lost for various reasons. We've had a number of examples over the years. A situation near the bridge where the individual was found at a later date from a water incident. Spontaneous memorial was set up adjacent to the road along the bench, along the dike. It gives you an example of that, spontaneous memorials that are developed based on all sorts of situations, not necessarily traffic incidents, but all sorts of other situations. Currently, we have no policy or direction around roadside memorials. We do have some memorial programs. We have a memorial bench program in place, and we are looking at other options. The benches are becoming very expensive, so we want to provide additional options to the public. And we're doing some further work around that. And we are considering other programs. Some centers have, it's a Halo program out of the city of Calgary. It's a band that's placed around a light standard And it has an angel embossed on it, and the family members or individuals memorialize an individual on that band. There's other ways we can add feathers, we're looking at all sorts of programs for that memorial aspect. But that's, again, it's sort of a separate program piece and not specifically in the policy presented today, because we're still working on development of those ideas. The policy for your review today provides a very specific outline to what it may be a memorial, roadside memorial might mean. And the definition being means crosses, markers, photos, flowers, personal items placed by the public in a road allowance. I might need to change that already to mark the location of a fatal incident. The town appreciates, excuse me, the placements of memorials to commemorate victims of incidents occurred spontaneously. And this is what we have seen. They happen quickly, spontaneously, not necessarily from immediate family always. It's other members of the public sometimes that develops with these memorials. But they're always in commemoration or to honor a victim in their memory. Excuse me. So the policy that we're proposing applies to public roadways, roads, sidewalks that are under the direct control and management of the town. So this would exclude provincial highways, of which we actually have quite a number within the community that intersect. We are proposing that the policy addresses that the memorials cannot present a hazard to those using the area. So if it's near a sidewalk, it can't block a sidewalk, it can't block or be a hazard on the roadway. It can't encroach onto sort of paved portions of roadways or sidewalks and cause sightline issues if it happens to be within an intersection area, or if it's not an intersection, if it causes some sightline issues. We're proposing authority to remove roadside memorials will be with the CAO, and the CAO can delegate that authority down if they so choose or address it directly. If we have to move these items for maintenance or potentially construction or other reasons, this policy allows us to do so. Roadside memorials, we're proposing they must be maintained by family or friends or whomever has put this up. But if it becomes an issue, then they can be addressed. Ideally, we would like to be able to go back to whomever set up the memorial. If we're in knowledge of that information of who it was, sometimes we don't know. Sometimes it takes a little while to find out. But usually it's a smaller community. We usually can find that out at some point. And we can go back to those originators of the memorial and ask them to remove it after a 3-month period. Or if it's become unsightly or it's become a problem for whatever reason, we can go to those contacts and ask them to address whatever the issue is. So the policy is presented for council's comments, feedback, ideas.
Councillor Ford?
So I'm aware of the example you gave us by the bridge for that memorial that went up there. Do you have a way of identifying in the policy the difference between a memorial like that and, for instance, where the bench and everything is set up down on the north end of town? Little bit different scenarios.
Yeah, and in that particular case, that was private property. And the bench was asked, the proposal for the bench in that particular case was brought forward to the town. We identified that it was not town property. So the bench was approved by the property owner. Now the expansion of that site could potentially be addressed in another manner through other bylaw mechanisms. But in this particular case, this policy wouldn't necessarily apply.
Yeah, I was looking at the difference between like the example you gave and then like murdered and missing Aboriginal women.
Yeah.
That kind of scenario. And then under item number 6, a maximum period of 3 months. I would personally probably like to see that cut down to about 1 month.
Okay. Like a 30 days. Thing and nodding.
Counselor Hood, did you have?
Yeah, I think I'd like, in section 6, I'd like to remove the word generally, because real words talk negotiation. Now, the other thing you could put in there, if you wanted to have some leeway under certain circumstances, is that an extension could be applied for under certain, to come up with some framework around that. But take up that the natural period will be X, an extension can be applied for under whatever conditions, and that way it gives you the ability, but you have a line.
Yeah, there's a line, but then there's some
Yeah, and
flexibility.
I think that would cover it, but I don't like words like generally.
Okay. That's great feedback.
Any other questions?
Any online questions?
Nothing up there. Is someone prepared to make a motion?
Deputy Mayor, I'll put forth a motion that council direct or administration be directed to bring the proposed roadside memorial policy forward to a future meeting for further discussion.
All those in favor? That is carried.
Thank you.
Unfinished business, there is none. Moving on to new business, we have Director Mudford.
Evening, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor Shannon, and Council. Tonight I have before you the 2024 draft utility budget. This is Council's first look at the utility budget for 2024. And begins with a high-level review of fund accounting and key assumptions. That presents the water, wastewater, solid waste, and storm sewer funds. And I'll show what consolidated figures look like and conclude with an opportunity for questions. So previously, prior to 2023 budget, all town funds were considered tax supported. So any deficits in the utility fund were offset by tax revenues. Masks on revenue shortfall would contribute to infrastructure deficits. With utility funds, the idea is that they should be self-liquidating to avoid cross subsidization, and any surplus within these self-liquidating funds should go to dedicated reserves to fund future capital for those assets. Excess reserves can be returned to the ratepayer if we were to get to a point that we felt that the reserves were sufficient. So one key change in the budgets this year from last year is this year we are including amortization expense in the budget. So again, amortization expense, that's an accounting term to show the cost of utilizing your capital assets over time. Principal repayment and interest expense on long-term debt are both still included in expenses. And for the 2023 comparables, you'll see contributions to capital reserves included in expenses. That's also still the case in storm sewer and in solid waste. Budget figures includes known figures. So if we have what the cost will be next year, if we've got a document to support that, we include that as part of the budget. Sometimes we're extrapolating from prior year trends, and sometimes we're just using the administration's best estimate. All these figures are subject to revision before final approval. And consistent with last year, within the miscellaneous expenses, we recorded transfer to the tax supported fund. So as best we can, we allocate if there's I'll use Director Fisher as an example. So his time is split between several different funds. And in his case, we set that when we prepare his payroll budget. But there's lots of costs that are smaller and more difficult to directly attribute. And so we use these transfers as a way to push some of that burden to the utility funds. Because otherwise the taxpayer would be paying for all of those costs. So moving on to the water fund. Again, apologies for the presentation on this. It's a little bit challenging because I'm trying to get everything on one slide here and best show our year-over-year change in budget. So in the top left corner, we have our revenues. The right side of the screen is all of our expenses by object. And then the bottom left-hand corner, I'm presenting what our net income is. So we're budgeting for a 5% increase in our metered water revenue. That is what's built into this budget at this time. Director Fisher, myself, and CAO Miller reviewed the expense side of the budget in significant detail and made meaningful reductions. Areas of focus were primarily contracted services, R&M building, and R&M equipment. Several of these line items were previously budgeted on contingent basis and they weren't supported by actuals at the time. So we're, as time goes on, we're reducing the amount that we're putting to those I guess, contingencies. Obviously, whenever you do that, it does create a bit of risk, right? It could be something that pops up that we don't have a budget for. And in those instances, we, depending on the level and the authority required, we return to council if it was significant. So what I want to show council so that there's a good understanding of the change that we made. In this bottom left-hand corner, you'll notice that in 2023's budget, we're showing a net income of $0. So, and the reason for that is because the contribution to capital of $992,920. That's basically a plugged expense to show that we have no income. And all of that then, from a budget perspective, would be reserved to fund capital replacement needs. That's not a GAAP expense. When I say GAAP, it's generally accepted accounting principles. Neither is principal on long-term debt. Amortization expenses. And so that's why in 2024, you'll see that we've got $1,542,400 of amortization expense. That is just related to our water system. So in 2024's budget, from a net income perspective, even though our revenues have gone up, and you'll see our expenses have also gone up from overall $4,400,000, they've gone up to $5,085,000. That's driven almost entirely as a result of the inclusion of that amortization expense. So when you normalize for those items, with the changes that we've made, the increase in revenue and the decrease in expenses, we've got an adjusted net income going from $1,418,000 up to $1,578,000. Moving on to the wastewater fund. Again, same practice that we applied previously. So we're now including amortization expense of $761,000. And when you normalize for our adjusted net income, it's about an increase of $240,000. Again, just for clarity, included in that water or wastewater fund is a 5% targeted increase to revenue. On the solid waste fund, just a couple of things that I'll highlight on this. The budget includes a $1 increase to residential rates, so $1 per month per user is what we've budgeted. Now there's a few significant variances when you look year over year. The biggest one being that we had 1 month of January, this recovered cost item, $61,280 from 2023. That was recovering those costs related to the charge that we received from the landfill operator. which also then reflected in higher waste disposal expenses. But on the whole, there weren't any other significant variances within this fund. Now, when I bring back to council the operating plan, one thing that I want to put on your radar is our current solid waste provider, GFL. Our contract with them expires in June 2025. So one of the advantages of building up this, it's on here as a capital reserve, but there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of what future provider will charge for that service when we go for proposal. You know, again, rates could be lower. Historically, on average, things have gone up over time. And we initially negotiated this as a five-year agreement. So that would have been done pre-COVID. Or just in the early days of COVID. So long and short of it is there is a risk that once we get to that point that we may be seeing higher charges or changes in service level at that time. And I'll restart our storm sewer fund. Again, not a huge amount of changes year over year in this. As I said, went through it with Director Fisher and CAO. We tweaked some of the expenses a little bit, areas that we saw we weren't spending, which reduced some of the expenses a little bit. And this fund also has a 5% increase in targeted revenues. So when all of this gets consolidated, from a net income perspective in 2024 is showing minus 931,000. Again, to highlight, that's inclusive of $2.3 million of amortization expense that previously wasn't in the budget. So when we adjust for all of those non-GAAP items and include the amortization expense, year over year, we're going from 2,252,000 as a net income number up to 2,610,000. So both increasing revenues and decreasing expenses. Ultimately, that figure goes back into capital. So that will be what we'll use to power our capital program for the coming years. Again, just want to highlight the importance to council that it's critical that our utility funds can support our current and future capital needs. And this will be brought back to council for final approval before the end of the year. Any questions?
Sir,
So if I could sort of like, my understanding of this is we're kind of doing to all of the other services like water, solid waste, etc. The kind of the theory that they should be self-supporting on the fees and revenues. Am I correct? And that taxation, they would be removed from it would be outside of the scope of regular taxation and included in the utilities fees. Am I correct? Sort of like what the theory is behind water is part of the reason for the expense of water expenses or power expenses, that you're no longer just paying for the use of the water itself, you're paying for the infrastructure. So am I correct in the understanding so far?
Yeah, that's correct. And also there's different users. So within the community, we have taxpayers, but we sell water to users outside the community. And so it needs to be defensive.
So if this had been done theoretically, had this been done for the last 50 or 100 years, those things never would have been, if somebody on the first day had said, water is going to be self-sufficient, power is going to be self-sufficient, etc., you would not have ended up with the infrastructure deficits that we've ended up with that are now being funded by taxation, because they would have been more, two things. One, they would have been more transparent. Secondly, they would have been more apparent in that they had been put off. Because all councils, and I don't know, a lot of councils will tend to defer over years. If things, depending on what's going on, they will defer. Oh, well, that road's lasted for 50 years. We're going to go for 55, which gets expanded to 60, which gets expanded to 75, and different kinds of. So this would tend to avoid that kind of procrastination, if I'm correct.
Yeah, like, again, in theory, you should have your capital plan that goes out a certain number of years. The best ones would go out the length of your longest, the life of your longest asset. So like previously when I worked in utilities, they had capital plans that go out 75 years. You can then present value back what the cost of that would basically be and then factor that into your rates. So if you know that you're gonna have an expense in 5 years, it's gonna be $10 million, you can debt finance it and fund it over the future cost, but you can also start to reserve some funds for that future replacement. And then, again, if you've got reserves, it gives you options, right? When we look at what, this is speaking generally, not specific to utilities, but the town currently has significant amount of debt, but it was borrowed at very low rates. If we had to go to the market to borrow that same amount of money today, it would be it seems to be significantly more expensive because of interest. So when you've got reserves, give you options, they give you flexibility. But you're bang on with your comments, Councilor.
Are there any more questions? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Ms. Chair. First of all, in the solid waste fund, so garbage is what I think of this one. This includes spring and fall cleanups as well as leaf and branch bins at the Centennial parking lot, does it?
Currently, yes, it's got spring and fall cleanup and the budget for the leaf bins for the same level of service that we had this year.
Okay, thank you. And another question, I didn't quite catch, GFL contracts expire in when?
It's June 2025. June of 2025.
2025, thank you. And another question, so at the end of this, in 2024, did I catch you correctly that our reserves or whatever we can spend on capital from this fund would be 2.6 million? Is that correct, or is that me misinterpreting something?
So it's well, again, I want to, some of those funds have been spoken for because the principal repayment on, so we currently include in our budget an expense for principal repayment of long-term debt, but those are known cash outlays that we're gonna have to make. So you need to back out those amounts.
So what will we have in reserves? If we had a project that suddenly appeared on the door, what would be in reserves that would be available to spend it on this category of utility?
I mean, again, if like on a consolidated basis, it would
Yes.
be, I might just get back to you on that, Madam Mayor, just because I'm trying
Okay.
to calculate this with a pen. I'm a bit more proficient when I've got Excel open.
Oh, thank you.
Dale Miller?
I just wanted to add in the future, next meeting, we will have a summary of reserve balances that will show opening, what we estimate 2023 to be adding, and then what we anticipate 2024 budget would bring to that reserve balance. So we'll do a total different presentation that'll have all of that included.
Any other questions? Is anyone willing to make a motion?
Thank you. I put a motion on the floor to move that council accept 2024 draft utilities budget presentation for information.
All those in favor? And it's carried.
Madam Chair, I have a little bit of a point of order. I forgot where I'm sitting that as mayor, I'm not supposed to make motions. So I don't know what we need to do about the motion I sponsored for section 6.2. Sorry.
if I'm correct, according to the procedural bylaw, being that you're not actually chairing the meeting, you are allowed.
No,
to make-
but it says mayor. The mayor cannot.
So whatever.
Okay.
As long as she's not sharing.
Okay, so, Kayla advised that it's okay for you to be making the motion, Mayor Manzer?
Oh, good. Okay, then I'll carry on making motions. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so we are now on to reports. There's 10 reports in front of us. If you have any questions on any of those, anyone?
I have questions.
Is your name, I'm sorry, Madam Mayor, is your hand up? Okay, go ahead.
So, sorry, you're gonna hear my papers flipping here. I see in one of the reports that community building and promoting public confidence, this is page 32, the launch of the council portal. So is this something new or what? This is in the CAO and Legislative Services report, but it's page 4 of that report, 32 of the package.
So that is a new feature that we've.
Sorry, can't hear.
That is a new feature that we've engaged with iCompass or with Diligent. It just kind of cleans up the front facing end of the Civic website and adds some features such as the subscription feature, so residents can go in and subscribe to agenda packages and minutes that they'd like to receive notification when they're published. And that doesn't just include council meetings or GMP meetings, that includes meetings like the Economic Development Committee and other public facing meetings. And then it's just a lot cleaner. I don't, if you're familiar with the Civic Web website before, it's just kind of like a bunch of folders. So this one is actually an interactive screen. And also links all of our agendas, minutes, and recorded council meetings really nicely on the front screen when you click on them. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I did go to the website and maybe I wasn't looking in the right place to see or recognize some differences, but this sounds like a good thing for residents as well as for council. Madam Chair, should I just skip along to any other reports or how would you like?
Absolutely.
Okay, so under community services and that department, I did have a question here someplace. Oh, a comment that it's nice to see the 2023 stats for the pool are up for usage compared to the 2022 ones. And it also, is that for the pool? Yep. And the private attendance seems to be holding its own. So that seems to be a good thing. Another question had to do with the museum and the Record Gazette archives and artifact storage. So is there any plan to digitize those at some point in the future?
Your worship, yes. Once we are able to secure approximately $85,000, we will. So we're looking for grant opportunities and the like. We have it proposed in the 5-year operating budget.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, I don't believe it was until 2025.
Yeah.
To give us some time to see if we can find some other grant opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Then I'm on to corporate services. I see a stat that the call volume for the fire department was up 31% with the year to date. Is that because of helping out with other municipalities' fire issues this year, like the forest fires and so forth, or is there a different reason?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's certainly a contributing factor, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I noticed fourth quarter that it looks like staff is still scheduled to maintain its certificate of recognition for health and safety, which seems to be a good thing and a bouquet to staff for doing that. And is that it for the reports? I think so. Thank you, Chair.
Are there any other questions for the reports?
I've got one about the engineering and infrastructure department report, because this is what I think apply there best, is the every week, it's been almost comical, the number of delays on solid waste cleanup, and I understand there've been a multitude of different reasons. They've been very exciting to kind of like throw your dart at a board and figure out which reason it's going to be delayed this week, but it's certainly going to be delayed. So I understand the contract is till 2025, and it's, you know, if it's going well, that's a short time. If it's going not well, that's actually kind of a long time. So are there any steps that we're kind of making to try to smooth out waste cleanup? Because I think the laugh emojis on Facebook are getting they're getting used quite thoroughly every time one of these things pops up. So I know it's not no one's fault around here, but it's just like, is there something we can do?
Thank you, Councilman. There are too many mics on? You can go. Who else has a mic on right now? Good. Is that, it's your mic?
It's you.
Oh, it's me, I'm the problem, it's me.
It's the metal plate.
Yeah, it's me. Okay, thank you, Councilor Shamahorn. That's actually a really good question. So we do get lots, and when I say lots, we're definitely getting a couple of missed pickups every week. And I think in most communities, to some degree, that is a pretty normal thing. The best thing that we can do and that we are trying to do as administration is hold our contractor to task on it. So as they're coming in, we're making sure that they're aware of them. And where there are legitimate reasons where they haven't been picked up, like the garbage being piled up too high on top of the bins, we're making sure that they are proving to us that was the case. So they're providing us photos in those instances. And then communicating that with the residents who are calling. And generally, I think for the most part, where there hasn't been a legitimate reason for it, like where they've just missed a pickup or they've had an equipment breakdown, we've really tried to get it dealt with that same week as a level of service so far. And I think we're going to keep trying to do that, understanding that they're human and they're going to still make some mistakes every once in a while. It's really valuable.
Yeah, it's sort of a trade-off with like the really great communication, because anytime there's a delay, it's like, boom, we put the notice out right away, but it also highlights the fact that it happens a lot. So it's like, it's kind of, you know, you're darned if you do and darned if you don't on that communication side of it. Thank you.
Any other questions on the reports? If not, is someone prepared to make a motion? Mr. Good.
I'll move the reports 1 through 10 be accepted for information.
All those in favor? And that is carried. And we're on to information, council communications package outline. Are there any questions stemming from that item? I see Mayor Manzer. Is that a hand up?
Sorry, so are we talking about variance reports as well or not? I should have asked a question about variance, I guess. I see.
Are you backing up now to the report section?
Sorry, yes, I am.
Okay.
So I just had a question. I appreciate that the percents were put in there, but then I have a question on the next two columns in these reports, the year-end forecast and the annual budget. So they basically seem identical except for, I think it's one item. So is the year-end forecast does not take into account what is known that will be an expected variance at the end of the year at this point in time? Like someplace in here, it said that recreation or community services actuals were 333,000 K below budget on a net basis. So is the expectation that that will be made up in the last quarter, or that the year-to-date year-end forecast would have been changed to reflect that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just an initial comment, I noticed one of the changes I made to this report template was shifting the summary of the revenues and expenses to the top, and I noticed a typo I just wanted to point out. So under the general operation, the budget year-to-date subtotal, that there's a formulaic error there, so that number should not be minus 2,329,436. It should actually be minus 237,089. Just wanted to highlight that. In terms of the forecasted variances, so the general trend has been that even our best efforts are to accrue things as we know about expenses and things like that. But we're generally hesitant to say that with certainty we're not going to spend the budget unless we've got absolute knowledge that we're not going to. The forecasted variance that was identified was due in large part to the NWT evacuation response.
Do you have any more questions, Madam Mayor?
Sorry, no, thank you.
Okay, so we're back on the information item. Is there any questions on that? On the communications package? Seeing none, is there someone willing to make a motion to accept that? Councillor Good?
I'll move that the information package be accepted as information.
All those in favor? That is carried. New communication items. Anyone? Councillor Ford?
Yeah, just to, thank you, just to step back to the information items in the communications package, I do see that there is going to be a November 11th event. I believe it's going to be at the Legion that we might want to highlight.
Okay, any other key communication items?
Madam Chair, if I could. So the ceremony is taking place at the Provincial Building, and then there will be a lunch over at the Legion. And I will be attending the ceremony to give a brief speech.
Okay, any other communication items? Or key communication items? Say. I would probably say the back to back. The utilities,
Draft budget.
our utility budget, I would say would be one other key communication item. No others? So now we'll be moving into closed.
Then we have a 5-minute recess. So that
Okay, well,
if we move to
moving in.
the chair, you can say we'll have a 5-minute recess. Then
Okay, we can have a 5-minute recess, then come back for the closed session.
Mayor has your hand.
Don't forget, we're live. We're gonna-
Yeah.
Thanks.
Here you go.